I still remember exactly where I was when I got the call. It was a Tuesday afternoon, around 14:30 hours. I was at Fort Hood. Or I guess I should say Fort Cavazos now. Sitting in the motor pool office of my new unit, reviewing maintenance schedules for a fleet of HMTs. That's heavy expanded mobility tactical trucks, for those of you who aren't familiar with military logistics vehicles. Each one of those beasts costs about $230,000, and I was responsible for keeping 12 of them running like clockwork. My phone buzzed. Unknown number, but the area code was from Fort Bliss. I almost didn't answer, but something in my gut told me to pick up. Staff Sergeant Feliciano. The voice on the other end was shaky, desperate, and unfortunately, very familiar. "This is Feliciano," I said, keeping my voice flat and professional. "Staff Sergeant, this is Lieutenant McLeod. I need your help. Everything is falling apart. We've got 3 FOBs completely black on supplies. The tracking system has crashed, and Colonel Patterson is threatening to have me court-martialed. Please. I'm begging you. I know I don't deserve to ask, but..." I let him hang there in silence for a good 10 seconds. "Lieutenant," I finally said, "with all due respect. You told me my experience didn't matter. You told me I was resistant to innovation. You had me transferred out of the unit 2 weeks before deployment because I was undermining your authority. Remember that." The line went quiet except for sounded like someone hyperventilating. "I remember everything you said to me in that office, Lieutenant. Every single word. And now you're calling me because the systems I spent 4 years building just collapsed under your improvements. Is that about right?" More silence. Then, barely a whisper, "Yes, Staff Sergeant, that's exactly right." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the Texas sun beating down on rows of military vehicles. "Well then, Lieutenant McLeod, let me tell you exactly how we got here, because I want you to understand every single decision that led to this moment. Let me take you back to the beginning. My name is Marcus Feliciano, and I've spent 24 years as a logistics specialist in the United States Army. I enlisted right out of high school in 1999, back when most kids my age were worried about Y2K, and whether their computers would survive the millennium. I was worried about how I was going to pay for college, support my mom after my dad passed, and make something of myself. The Army gave me purpose. More importantly, it gave me a skill set that most people don't even know exists. You see, when most civilians think about the military, they think about infantry soldiers kicking down doors, special operators fast, roping from helicopters, or fighter pilots, pulling GS in million-dollar aircraft. What they don't think about is the massive, intricate, absolutely essential system that keeps all of those warriors fed, fueled, armed, and operational. That system is logistics, and I became one of the best logisticians in the entire United States Army. Let me paint you a picture of what military logistics actually looks like in a combat zone. Imagine you're running a Walmart the size of a small city, except that Walmart is in the middle of a desert, surrounded by people who want to kill you, supplied by convoys that get attacked regularly, dependent on equipment that breaks down in 130-degree heat, and serving customers who will literally die if you run out of water, ammunition, or medical supplies. Oh, and your inventory system has to track everything from rifle cleaning kits to main battle tank engines, from MRS to encrypted communications equipment, from bootlaces to Hellfire missiles. We're talking millions of individual items, spread across dozens of locations, in an environment where a single mistake can mean soldiers go hungry, vehicles sit disabled, or worst of all, someone doesn't have the ammunition they need when the bullets start flying. That's what I did for 24 years. And I was exceptional at it. My first deployment was to Kuwait in 2003, right at the start of Operation Iraqi Freedom. I was a young specialist, fresh out of advanced individual training, and I had no idea what I was getting into. But I learned fast. I learned that the formal systems and procedures we trained on back in the States were just the starting point. The real skill was adaptation. figuring out how to make things work when the official system broke down. And in combat, the official system always broke down. By my second deployment, I was running a supply room for an infantry company in Baghdad. By my third, I was managing distribution for an entire forward operating base in Afghanistan. By my fourth, I was the senior logistics NCO for a battalion level task force operating across 3 provinces. Each deployment, I learned something new. I developed systems and procedures that weren't in any manual. I built relationships with local contractors, learned which supply routes were reliable and which ones were death traps, figured out how to get critical parts when the official requisition system said they were 6 weeks out. I made mistakes, too. Every logistician does. But I learned from every single one of them. When I wasn't deployed, I was at Fort Bliss, working in the Division G4 shop. That's the logistics section at the division level. I spent 4 years there, building what I genuinely believe was the most efficient and resilient logistics tracking system that any division had ever seen. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because you need to understand what was lost. The system I built wasn't just a spreadsheet or a database. It was an entire ecosystem of interconnected processes, redundancies, and relationships. Combined the Army's official property tracking software with custom-built verification protocols, manual backup systems, and a network of human checkpoints that caught errors before they became disasters. I personally trained every single logistics NCO in the system. I wrote the procedures, created the training materials, and spent hundreds of hours making sure that everyone understood not just what to do, but why they were doing it. The system had been tested in 2 major deployments. It had survived equipment failures, personnel turnover, even a cyber attack that took down the division's network for 3 days. Through all of it, we never lost accountability of a single sensitive item. We never had a supply blackout at any forward location. We never failed a logistics readiness inspection. That system was my legacy, my life's work. And then Second Lieutenant Bradley McLeod arrived. I remember the exact date, March 15, 2023. The Ides of March. If I had known what was coming, I might have appreciated the historical irony. I was in my office in the G4 shop, going over equipment readiness reports for our upcoming deployment to Syria. We were scheduled to take over a logistics hub at Al-Tanf, a critically important base near the Syrian, Jordanian, Iraqi border. The outgoing unit had left the place in rough shape, and I was already developing plans to get everything squared away within the first 30 days. My first hint that something was wrong came when our shop chief, Master Sergeant Williams, walked into my office with a look on his face like someone had just told him his dog died. "Feliciano," he said, closing the door behind him, "we need to talk." I put down my reports. "What's going on, Top?" He sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. Master Sergeant Williams was a 20-year veteran who had seen everything the Army could throw at a person. I had never seen him look this uncomfortable. "We're getting a new logistics officer," he said. "Lieutenant Colonel Morrison is retiring next month, and Division is sending us his replacement early so he can get spun up before the deployment." I nodded. Officer turnover was normal, even if the timing was less than ideal. What's the problem?" Williams rubbed his face with both hands. "The problem is who they're sending us, Second Lieutenant McLeod. Bradley McLeod IV. The name didn't ring any bells for me. Fresh out of the basic officer leader course. Fresh out of West Point, then BULC, and apparently some kind of accelerated MBA program that the Army paid for. The official story is that he's some kind of logistics wonderkind, fast-tracked for great things. And the unofficial story." Williams looked at me with tired eyes. "His father is Colonel Harrison McLeod, the division chief of staff. And his grandfather was Major General McLeod, who commanded this division back in the 90s. I felt my stomach drop. "So he's a legacy," I said. "More than that, word is that his father specifically requested that he get this assignment. Our unit, our deployment. Colonel McLeod wants his son to get deployment experience for his career progression, and he wanted him somewhere that the systems were already solid. Somewhere he couldn't fail. I understood immediately what Williams was saying. Someone with powerful connections was sending their inexperienced son to our unit, specifically because we had spent years making everything run so smoothly that even an incompetent officer couldn't mess it up, or so they thought. When does he arrive? I asked. Tomorrow morning. And Feliciano? Williams paused, choosing his words carefully. I've heard some things, through the NCO network. Apparently, this lieutenant has some strong opinions about how things should be done. Very strong opinions. What kind of opinions? The kind that come from business school and not from experience. Just be careful, that's all I'm saying. Second Lieutenant Bradley McLeod IV arrived at 0900 the next morning, driving a brand new Mercedes-Benz SUV that probably cost more than my annual salary. I watched from the office window as he climbed out, adjusted his perfectly pressed uniform, and surveyed the building with the air of a man who already owned everything he was looking at. He was young, maybe 24, 25 at most. Tall, fit, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from a lifetime of never being told no. His uniform was immaculate, his boots were polished to a mirror shine, and his bearing suggested that he had spent considerable time practicing how to look commanding in front of a mirror. First impressions can be wrong. I've met plenty of junior officers who looked arrogant but turned out to be excellent leaders once they learned to listen. I told myself to give this kid a fair chance. That resolution lasted approximately 15 minutes. The meeting was held in the conference room adjacent to Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's office. Morrison himself was there, looking tired and clearly ready to start his retirement. Master Sergeant Williams was there, along with myself and the other senior NCOs from the logistics section. Lieutenant McLeod strode in like he was taking command of an aircraft carrier, not joining a division logistics shop as the most junior officer present. Good morning, everyone, he announced, not waiting for Colonel Morrison to introduce him. I'm Second Lieutenant Bradley McLeod. I know I'm new here, and I know there's a deployment coming up. So let me just say up front, I've done my research on this unit, and I have some ideas about how we can improve our operational efficiency by at least 30%. I glanced at Williams. His face was carefully blank, but I could see his jaw tighten. Colonel Morrison cleared his throat. Lieutenant, perhaps we should start with introductions. Of course, sir, McLeod interrupted. But I want everyone to know that I'm not here to just maintain the status quo. I studied logistics optimization at Wharton before I came into the Army, and I've already identified several areas where we're using outdated methodologies that are costing us time and resources. He pulled out a tablet and began connecting it to the conference room display. Nobody had asked for a presentation. For example, he continued, I've reviewed your property tracking system, and frankly, I'm amazed that we're still using manual verification checkpoints. In the private sector, this would all be automated with RFID, tracking and cloud-based inventory management. The redundant human checks you have built into the system are adding an estimated 47 man-hours per week of unnecessary labor. I couldn't stay silent any longer. Sit, I said, keeping my voice respectful. Those manual verification checkpoints exist because the automated systems have a failure rate of about 12% in deployed environments. Dust, heat, electronic interference, enemy jamming. There are a lot of factors that can knock out automated tracking. The human checkpoints are our backup. Lieutenant McLeod looked at me like I had just suggested that the earth was flat. And you are? Staff Sergeant Feliciano, sir. Senior Logistics NCO. I've been managing this system for the past 4 years. Ah yes, Staff Sergeant Feliciano, he said, my name like he was reading it off an index card of people who would eventually need to be dealt with. I reviewed your personnel file. Very impressive deployment history. But with all due respect, your experience is from a different era. Modern logistics management has moved far beyond manual redundancy. Those methods are relics of the pre-digital age. Sir, my last deployment was 18 months ago, and the automated systems failed 3 times during that deployment. Each time, the manual backups kept us from losing accountability of millions of dollars in equipment. McLeod smiled. It was the kind of smile that a particularly patient adult gives to a child who doesn't understand a simple concept. Staff Sergeant, I appreciate your experience. I really do. But I think you've developed a certain attachment to the old ways of doing things, which is natural. What I'm proposing is a fundamental restructuring of our logistics architecture to bring it in line with 21st century best practices. Colonel Morrison finally interjected. Lieutenant, perhaps we should wait until you've had a chance to observe our current operations before proposing major changes. Staff Sergeant Feliciano has an excellent track record, and his systems have performed flawlessly in every inspection and deployment. With respect. Sir, McLeod said, that's exactly kind of thinking that holds organizations back. Just because something hasn't failed yet doesn't mean it's optimal. I believe in continuous improvement, not complacency. The meeting went on for another 45 minutes. By the end of it, I knew exactly what kind of person we were dealing with. Lieutenant McLeod was not just confident. He was absolutely certain that his academic knowledge was superior to our practical experience. Every objection raised by the NCOs dismissed as resistance to change or attachment to outdated methods. Every time someone tried to explain why we did things a certain way, he countered with theoretical principles from his business school coursework. And the most dangerous part, he was smart. He wasn't some idiot who didn't understand logistics. He understood the theory perfectly. He could quote optimization algorithms and efficiency metrics with ease. On paper, his ideas made a certain kind of sense. But paper doesn't bleed. Paper doesn't have to function when the power goes out, when the network goes down, when a sandstorm knocks out half your communications, or when an IED hits a supply convoy, and suddenly your entire distribution plan needs to be recalculated in minutes. Paper doesn't know what it's like to be responsible for keeping soldiers alive in a combat zone. As we filed out of the conference room, Master Sergeant Williams fell into step beside me. Well, he said quietly, that was interesting. That's one word for it. What are you thinking, Feliciano? I considered the question carefully. I'm thinking that this lieutenant is going to try to change everything we've built. And I'm thinking that when his changes fail, we're going to be the ones who have to fix the mess. Williams nodded slowly. That's what I was afraid you'd say. The next month was one of the most frustrating periods of my entire military career. Lieutenant McLeod wasted no time implementing his efficiency improvements. Within the first week, convinced Colonel Morrison to let him streamline several of our processes on a trial basis. The colonel, who was clearly just trying to get through his final days without any drama, approved the changes with minimal pushback. The first target was our manual inventory verification system. Under the system I had built, every piece of equipment had to be physically verified by a human being at 4 different checkpoints: initial receipt, storage allocation, pre-issue inspection, and post-issue confirmation. Yes, it required more manpower. Yes, it added time to the process. But it also meant that nothing could fall through the cracks. Lieutenant McLeod called this redundant inefficiency. He reduced the physical verification points from 4 to 1, a single check at the point of receipt, and replaced the others with automated RFID scanning. I objected, formally, in writing. Sir, I wrote in my memo, the manual verification points serve as a failsafe against system errors, equipment malfunction, and deliberate manipulation. Removing them creates single points of failure throughout the supply chain. In a deployed environment, system outages are not uncommon, and when they occur, we will have no way to verify equipment status without the manual backups. Lieutenant McLeod's response was to call me into his office for a counseling session. "Staff Sergeant Feliciano," he said, leaning back in his chair with his feet on the desk, a gesture that I found profoundly disrespectful. "I want to talk to you about your attitude." "My attitude, sir?" "Your memo about the verification system. I appreciate that you took the time to write it, but honestly, it reads like someone who's afraid of change, someone who doesn't trust technology, someone who, frankly, might be a little bit threatened by new leadership." I kept my face neutral. "Sir, my concerns are based on operational experience. I've seen automated systems fail in the field. I'm not opposed to technology. I'm opposed to removing the safeguards that protect us when technology fails." "But that's just it, Staff Sergeant. You're thinking about failure. I'm thinking about success. About optimization. About preparing this unit for the future, not clinging to the past." He leaned forward, fixing me with what he probably thought was an intense leadership stare. "Here's what I need from you. I need you to get on board with the new direction. I need you to stop submitting memos that undermine my authority, and I need you to understand that this is my shop now, and we're going to do things my way. Are we clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." "Good. Dismissed." The second major change came 2 weeks later. Lieutenant McLeod decided that our supply convoy routing system was inefficient. Under my system, convoys followed routes that had been established through years of experience, taking into account not just distance and time, but also terrain conditions, historical enemy activity, communications coverage, and contingency support availability. Some of these routes were longer than the optimal paths that mapping software would suggest. But they were safer, more reliable, and had proven track records. McLeod didn't care about any of that. We're spending thousands of extra dollars per month on fuel costs because our routes are 10 to 15% longer than necessary. He announced at a staff meeting, "I've developed new routing protocols using advanced logistics modeling software. These new routes will save us significant resources and reduce delivery times by an average of 43 minutes per convoy." Again, I objected. "Sir, those routes go through areas with poor communications coverage. If a convoy has a breakdown or encounters hostile activity on those routes, response times will be significantly delayed. The current routes were designed with contingency support in mind." Lieutenant McLeod actually rolled his eyes. "Staff Sergeant Feliciano, we're not in a war zone yet. We're at Fort Bliss. There's no hostile activity. There's no need for the same level of caution we might use in a deployment." "Sir, my concern is that we're establishing procedures now that will carry over into the deployment. If we train on these new routes here, soldiers will expect to use similar routing logic in Syria. And in Syria, those 43 minutes we save could cost lives." "I appreciate your input," McLeod said, in a tone that indicated he did not appreciate my input at all. "But I've made my decision. The new routing protocol takes effect immediately." I looked around the room at the other NCOs. Some of them looked as concerned as I felt. Others had already developed the glazed expression of soldiers who knew there was no point in fighting. The third change was the one that really set the stage for disaster. Lieutenant McLeod decided that our battalion's deployment supply chain needed to be consolidated for efficiency. Under the existing system, we maintained relationships with multiple contractors and supply vendors. This was intentional. If one vendor failed to deliver, we had backups already in place. Cost more money upfront, but it provided resilience. McLeod saw only the additional cost. "We're paying premium prices to multiple vendors for the same services," he argued. "If we consolidate everything under a single, competitively bid contract, we can save the battalion at least $340,000 over the deployment." The single vendor he had in mind was a company called Allied Strategic Logistics Solutions. I had never heard of them before, which immediately raised red flags. In 24 years of military logistics, I knew all the major players in the defense contracting space. I did some digging. What I found was alarming. Allied Strategic Logistics Solutions was a company that had been founded 18 months earlier. They had no track record of military contracts. Their corporate address was a P.O. box in Delaware. And their chief operating officer was a man named Preston Ashford, who had graduated from Wharton Business School in the same year as Lieutenant McLeod. More digging revealed that the Preston Ashford had been Bradley McLeod's roommate during their MBA program. I brought this information to Master Sergeant Williams. "Top," I said, laying out the documents I had gathered. "This company has no experience, no track record, and it's run by the lieutenant's college buddy. This has disaster written all over it." Williams studied the documents with a furrowed brow. "This is concerning. Have you brought this to the Colonel?" Colonel Morrison retired last week. The new battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, just took over. He doesn't know me for an atom, and Lieutenant McLeod has already briefed him on his efficiency initiatives. According to the rumor mill, Colonel Harrison loves the idea of saving free 40,000. What about going higher? Inspector General. I shook my head. I thought about it, but what do I actually have? A legitimate concern about a company's experience level. That's not fraud. That's not corruption. It's just questionable judgment. And if I go to the IG and they find nothing actionable, I'm done. McLeod will have me transferred or worse. Williams was quiet for a long moment. "So what do you want to do?" "I want to document everything. Every decision, every objection I raise, every time he overrules me. This goes bad, and I think it will. I want a paper trail that shows exactly who made what decisions." "That's smart. But Feliciano." Williams paused, choosing his words carefully. "Be careful. This kid has connections that go all the way to division. If he decides you're the enemy, he has the power to make your life very difficult." The final confrontation came 6 weeks before our deployment to Syria. I had done exactly what I told Master Sergeant Williams I would do. I documented everything. Every time Lieutenant McLeod made a decision that I believed endangered our mission, I filed a formal objection through the appropriate channels. Every time he overruled me, I documented his reasoning and my concerns. The folder on my computer had grown to over 200 pages. The breaking point came when McLeod announced that he was eliminating the position of Senior Logistics NCO. My position. Entirely. "The role is redundant," he explained at a staff meeting, as casually as if he were discussing what to order for lunch. "The functions currently performed by the Senior Logistics NCO can be distributed among the junior NCOs with proper automated system support. This will save us one E7 billet that can be reallocated to another section." I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage, "the Senior Logistics NCO position exists because someone needs to have overall visibility of the entire supply chain. The junior NCOs each manage their individual sections, but someone needs to connect all the pieces. That's what I do. And that's what our new integrated logistics management system will do," McLeod countered. "The software connects all the sections automatically. We don't need a human being doing what a computer can do better." "With respect, sir, the computer can track data. It can't make judgment calls. It can't look at a situation and decide that something doesn't feel right, can't build relationships with contractors or troubleshoot problems that don't fit into the programmed parameters." McLeod smiled that infuriating smile again. "Staff Sergeant Feliciano, I've tried to be patient with you. I really have. But your constant resistance to every improvement I try to implement has become a serious problem. You're undermining my authority, you're slowing down our modernization efforts, and frankly, you're creating a toxic environment in this shop." "Sir, I'm trying to prevent a disaster. What you're trying to do is hold on to your own power and relevance. And I'm sorry, but that's not going to happen. The army is modernizing whether you like it or not, and soldiers who can't adapt to change need to step aside for those who can." He straightened his papers and looked at me, with an expression of practiced sympathy. "I've already spoken with the battalion commander. Given the tensions between us, we both agreed that it would be best if you were transferred to another unit before the deployment. I'm recommending that you be reassigned to the division rear detachment, where you can finish out your last 2 years before retirement without the stress of a combat deployment." I sat in stunned silence. 24 years. 24 years of service, 6 combat deployments, a system that I had built from the ground up. And this kid was sending me to the rear detachment, to the place where the army put soldiers who were broken, in trouble, or just marking time until they could leave. "Sir," I said slowly, "you're making a mistake, serious mistake. When you get to Syria and your automated systems fail, and they will fail, you're going to need someone who knows how to run things the old way. You're going to need institutional knowledge that can't be replaced by software." Lieutenant McLeod leaned back in his chair with an expression of bemused condescension that I had come to know all too well. "Staff Sergeant Feliciano," he said, pronouncing each word slowly as if explaining something to a particularly dim child, "let me be very clear about something. I have a degree from West Point. I have an MBA from Wharton. I have studied logistics theory at institutions that produce the leaders of Fortune 500 companies and military operations worldwide. I have analyzed case studies from every major supply chain success and failure of the past 50 years. He paused for effect, clearly pleased with his own credentials. "You have experience. And while I respect that experience, I need you to understand something fundamental. Experience is just repetition. It's doing the same thing over and over again. What I bring is optimization. I bring systems thinking. I bring data-driven decision-making. I bring the future." I could feel my jaw tightening, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Sir, with all due respect, the case studies you analyzed in your MBA program were written about situations that had already been resolved. The professors knew how each scenario ended. That's not how the real world works. In the real world, especially in a combat zone, you don't have perfect information. You don't have time to run regression analyses. You have to make decisions under pressure, with incomplete data, and accept that sometimes the answer is exactly wrong. And that," McLeod said, pointing his finger at me like he was delivering a verdict, "is exactly the kind of antiquated thinking that I'm trying to move this unit away from. You're so wedded to your experience that you can't even imagine that there might be better ways of doing things. That's not wisdom, Staff Sergeant. That's fear." He stood up from his desk and walked to the window, adopting what I'm sure he thought was a commanding pose. "I'm going to give you a choice. You can accept the transfer to Division Rear Detachment quietly, keep your head down for the next 2 years, and retire with your full benefits and pension. Or," he turned to face me, "you can continue to fight me, in which case I will document your insubordination, your resistance to lawful orders, and your toxic influence on unit morale. And trust me, Staff Sergeant, my documentation will be very thorough." I looked at this 24-year-old child who had never spent a single day in a combat zone, who had never held a dying soldier's hand while waiting for medevac, who had never felt the weight of being responsible for keeping hundreds of people alive in an environment designed to kill them. And I made my decision. "I'll take the transfer, sir." McLeod smiled triumphantly. "I knew you'd see reason. But I want to make sure you understand something first." I stood up, and for the first time, I let my real feelings show in my voice. "Everything I've told you about how our systems work, about why the redundancies exist, about the risks you're creating, all of it is documented. Every objection I've raised is in writing. Every warning I've given is on the record. Is that supposed to be a threat?" "No, sir. It's not a threat. It's a prediction. When your systems fail, and they will fail, people are going to want to know why. They're going to investigate. They're going to look at every decision that was made. And they're going to find my documentation showing exactly what I told you would happen, and exactly when I told you. I walked to the door, and paused with my hand on the handle. I hope I'm wrong, Lieutenant. I genuinely do. Because if I'm right, soldiers are going to suffer for your arrogance. Good luck in Syria. You're going to need it. The next 3 weeks were a blur of transition activities. I spent every available moment ensuring that my documentation was complete and properly filed. I created detailed guides for every aspect of the logistics system. Not for Lieutenant McLeod, who had made it clear he didn't want my input, but for the junior NCOs who would be left behind to deal with the aftermath of his decisions. I pulled each of them aside, one by one, and gave them the same advice: document everything. When, not if, things start going wrong, protect yourself. Make sure every questionable order you follow has a paper trail showing that you objected and were overruled. Don't fall on your sword for this guy. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, my closest colleague in the logistics section, was near tears when we said goodbye. "This isn't right, Filiano," she said. "You built this system. You're the only one who really understands how all the pieces fit together. Without you, without me, you're gonna have to adapt. Just like we always do." I put my hand on her shoulder. "Listen to me, Rodriguez. This guy is going to implement a bunch of changes that look great on paper. Some of them might actually work. But sooner or later, something is going to go wrong that his software can't handle. When that happens, fall back on the fundamentals. The stuff I taught you. The stuff that isn't in any manual because it's just common sense that you learn from experience. What if his system completely collapses? What do we do then?" I handed her a thumb drive. "Everything on here. Every procedure I ever created, every backup protocol, every contingency plan. It's not official documentation. McLeod would probably have me court-martialed if he knew I was giving it to you. But if everything goes sideways, this is your lifeline." She took the drive and tucked it into her pocket. "I hope we never need it." So do I. Hope isn't a plan. My last day in the logistics section was May 15, 2023. I cleaned out my desk, said goodbye to the soldiers I had worked with for 4 years, and walked out of the building for the last time. Lieutenant McLeod didn't bother to say goodbye. He was in a meeting with representatives from Allied Strategic Logistics Solutions, finalizing the contract that would make them the sole supplier for the battalion's deployment needs. As I drove across post to my new assignment in the Division Rear Detachment, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was relief at being away from the daily frustration of watching someone systematically dismantle everything I had built. There was grief at leaving the unit I had served with for years. And there was dread. A deep, gnawing certainty that something terrible was going to happen. The rear detachment assignment was exactly what I expected. Paperwork, administrative tasks, and a lot of time sitting around waiting for the deployment to start so we could begin processing replacements and equipment returns. My new supervisor was a retired sergeant major who had been brought back as a civilian contractor, and he took one look at my service record and told me to do whatever I wanted. "You're obviously way too qualified to be here," he said. "Just keep your head down, stay out of trouble, and count the days until you can retire." So that's what I did. For 6 weeks, I processed paperwork, helped a few confused privates navigate the military bureaucracy, and tried not to think about what was happening at my old unit. The deployment kicked off on June 10th. I watched from a distance as the battalion loaded onto buses headed for the airfield, then onto aircraft headed for Kuwait, and eventually convoys headed into Syria. Lieutenant McLeod was in charge of the logistics operation, supported by his hand team and his single-source contractor. For the first month, I heard nothing. No news was presumably good news. Then, the first cracks began to appear. I still had contacts in the unit, of course. Despite Lieutenant McLeod's attempts to isolate me, I had spent 4 years building relationships with NCOs throughout the battalion. And when things started going wrong, they reached out. The first warning sign came from Sergeant Rodriguez, 3 weeks after the deployment started. Feliciano, you were right. The automated tracking system crashed yesterday. Full system failure. We're completely blind. No idea where half our equipment is. The lieutenant is blaming everyone but himself. He keeps saying the software company promised this couldn't happen. I responded with advice: fall back on the manual protocols, use the backup documentation, work with the junior NCOs to rebuild visibility item by item. That's what we're trying to do, Rodriguez replied. But half the people who knew how to do it that way are gone. He transferred out everyone who disagreed with him. Remember, the soldiers we have left were trained on his new and improved system. They don't know the old methods. I felt sick to my stomach. A week later, things got worse. The contractor, Allied Strategic, they missed a delivery, big one. Ammunition, fuel, and spare parts for the vehicles. They said there was a logistics delay, and the shipment would be 2 weeks late. 2 weeks? We're operating at 40% capability, because we don't have the supplies we need. I asked the obvious question: what happened to the backup suppliers? The redundant contracts I had maintained with multiple vendors. He canceled them all. Said they were inefficient. Allied Strategic is our only supplier. And they're failing. The tenant is on the phone with their headquarters every day, threatening legal action, but that doesn't help us none. More stories trickled in over the following days. Optimized convoy routes that Kuwait had implemented turned out to be disasters. One convoy broke down in an area with no communications coverage, and had to wait 6 hours for recovery. Another took a route that went through territory that had recently seen increased hostile activity. A fact that my old system would have flagged, but McLeod's software didn't track. The single verification point system meant that equipment discrepancies weren't caught until it was too late. A shipment of radios that looked fine when they arrived turned out to be the wrong encryption variant. A problem that would have been caught at the pre-issue inspection checkpoint that McLeod eliminated. The battalion spent a week with compromised communications because of it. And through it all, Lieutenant McLeod refused to acknowledge that anything was his fault. He keeps saying we're experiencing normal deployment friction. Rodriguez told me in one message. He says every deployment has challenges and we just need to adapt and overcome. Meanwhile, we've got soldiers eating 2 meals a day instead of 3, because the food supplies are backed up, and half our vehicles are deadline for parts that nobody can track. The final disaster struck on August 3, 2023. I was sitting in my office in the re-detachment, reviewing some mind-numbingly boring inventory paperwork, when my phone started buzzing with message after message. The first one was from Rodriguez. It's all fallen apart. Everything. Call me when you can. The second was from another NCO I knew. Holy cow, Feliciano. You called it. You absolutely called it. The third was from Master Sergeant Williams, who had deployed with the unit. Feliciano. It's worse than you can imagine. The entire forward logistics network has collapsed. We've got 3 FOBs completely black on supplies. The contractor has gone dark. Won't answer calls or emails. The tracking system crashed again, and we can't get it back up. Colonel Patterson is losing his mind. McLeod is in his office with the door locked. I immediately called Williams. Give me the full picture, I said when he answered. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't slept in days. The full picture is we are completely, catastrophically screwed. Here's what happened. He laid it out for me, piece by piece. Allied Strategic Logistics Solutions had been running on fumes from the beginning. Preston Ashford and his team had drastically underbid the contract to win it, assuming they could cut corners and make up the difference. What they hadn't counted on was the real-world complexity of supplying a battalion operating in multiple locations across a hostile country. Their supply chain started breaking down within the first month. Shipments were late. Quality control was non-existent. Their tracking software, which Lieutenant McLeod had insisted was state-of-the-art, was actually a barely functional system that crashed whenever too many people tried to use it simultaneously. For weeks, they had been hiding the problems, sending partial shipments and falsifying delivery documentation. Lieutenant McLeod, who had staked his professional reputation on this contractor, had been either complicit or willfully blind. It wasn't clear which. And then, 2 days ago, Allied Strategic Logistics SUS had simply stopped. What do you mean stopped? I asked. I mean stopped. Ceased operations. Their corporate accounts have been frozen. There's some kind of fraud investigation happening back in the States. Their employees abandoned the operation overnight. Every shipment that was supposed to be in transit is sitting in a warehouse somewhere in Kuwait, and nobody can tell us where or how to get access to it. Jesus Christ. It gets worse. Without their shipments, our supply situation has gone from concerning to critical. FO Thunder is out of ammunition. They've got enough for one sustained engagement, maybe. And then they're throwing rocks. FOB Hammer is out of fuel. They can't move vehicles. They can't run generators. They're rationing water. FOB Lightning has soldiers eating emergency rations because the food supplies never arrived. What about emergency resupply? Division assets. Division is scrambling, but it takes time to spin up new supply lines. The earliest they can get us significant support is a week out, maybe more. And in the meantime, we've got soldiers in danger because we can't support them. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. This was exactly what I had warned would happen. Every single thing I had predicted, in writing, with timestamps. What does the colonel want? The colonel wants a miracle, and he's not going to get one from Lieutenant McLeod, who has apparently had some kind of breakdown. He's been in his room for 12 hours, not responding to anyone. What about you? What do you need? Williams was quiet for a moment. I need you, Feliciano. I know you're 1,000 miles away, but you're the only one who knows how all the pieces fit together. Rodriguez has your thumb drive, but even with that documentation, we don't have anyone who can implement it. We need you to walk us through, step by step, how to rebuild visibility and establish emergency supply relationships. I looked at my watch. It was 1400 local time. Start a video call with everyone who's left from the logistics section. I'll talk you through everything I know, and tell the colonel that if he wants any chance of unfucking this situation, he needs to authorize emergency contracts with the backup suppliers I maintained relationships with. They're not cheap, but they're reliable, and right now reliable is all that matters. I spent the next 18 hours on video calls, walking the exhausted logistics team through emergency procedures that should never have been necessary. We rebuilt basic visibility of the supply chain using the manual protocols that McLeod had eliminated. We established emergency contracts with 3 different suppliers I had worked with over the years. Companies that knew me by name and were willing to mobilize on short notice because of the relationships I had built. We identified the location of the abandoned shipments in Kuwait and coordinated with division assets to recover them. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't efficient. Definitely wasn't optimized. But by dawn on August 5th, supply convoys were rolling again. FOB Thunder got their ammunition. FOB Hammer got their fuel. FOB Lightning got actual food instead of emergency rations. Soldiers who might have died because they ran out of ammunition instead had what they needed to defend themselves. Vehicles that might have been sitting targets because they couldn't move were back in operation. The deployment was saved, no thanks to 2nd Lieutenant Bradley McLeod IV. And that brings us back to where I started this story. August 8, 2023. Me, sitting in my office at Fort Hood, staring at my phone as Lieutenant Bradley McLeod begged for help. Staff Sergeant Feliciano, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know I don't deserve to ask. I know I was wrong about everything. But Colonel Patterson is talking about court-martial. He's talking about a formal investigation that could end my career. Please. There has to be something you can do. I let the silence stretch out until it became uncomfortable. Lieutenant. I finally said. Let me make sure I understand what you're asking. You spent 3 months telling me that my experience was worthless. You eliminated my position. You transferred me out of the unit, so I couldn't undermine your authority. You dismantled every safety system I built and replaced them with theoretical improvements that failed exactly the way I said they would. And now you want me to save you from the consequences of your own decisions. Yes, I guess that's what I'm asking. Why would I do that? Silence. Because. McLeod's voice cracked. Because I don't know what else to do. My father won't take my calls. The battalion commander is talking about putting the contractor failure and the supply crisis in his command investigation report. The investigation team is looking at my emails with Preston Ashford, and they're asking questions about bid rigging and conflict of interest. Everything I worked for, everything I built. Everything you built was a house of cards, Lieutenant. And now it's collapsed. I let that sink in. But let me ask you a question. In all the hours you spent studying logistics theory at Wharton, did you ever study the concept of redundancy? What? Redundancy. The practice of having backup systems in case the primary system fails. It's considered inefficient by some people. Wasteful, even. But it exists for a reason. And I'm going to tell you a secret that nobody teaches in business school. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, waiting. The secret is this: experience isn't just repetition. Experience is collecting failures. Every deployment, every crisis, every time something went wrong, I learned from it. I built those redundancies into my system, not because I read about them in a textbook, but because I had personally seen what happens when they don't exist. I had watched equipment get lost, soldiers go without supplies, operations fail because somewhere decided that backup systems were inefficient. I understand that now, McLeod said quietly. Do you? Do you really? Because here's what I need you to understand, Lieutenant. Those antiquated methods, you dismissed. They existed because soldiers had died without them. Those manual verification points you eliminated. They were built on lessons written in blood. Every single element of that system represented a hard-won lesson from someone's worst day. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't unfuck the supply chain. Sorry doesn't give back the ammunition that FOB Thunder didn't have. Sorry doesn't undo the 12-hour communications blackout at FOB Lightning. Sorry doesn't erase the fact that soldiers were eating emergency rations because the food didn't arrive. Then what can I do? I thought about it. Part of me, the petty, vindictive part, wanted to tell him there was nothing he could do. That he had made his bed and now he could lie in it. That his career was over and there was nothing that could save it. But the thing is, I'm not actually a petty person. I spent 24 years in the army because I believed in service, in doing the right thing even when it was hard, and the right thing here wasn't letting a young officer's career be destroyed because he was arrogant and inexperienced. The right thing was making sure this never happened again. Here's what you can do, I said. You can cooperate fully with the investigation. You can be honest about every decision you made and why you made it. You can take responsibility without making excuses. But my career, your career as a fast-tracked logistics wonderkind is over, Lieutenant. That ship has sailed. But you're 24 years old. You have a long career ahead of you if you want it. The question is what kind of officer you want to be. You can be the kind who blames everyone else for his failures and spends the rest of his career making the same mistakes. Or you can be the kind who learns from his failures and becomes better because of them. I paused to let that sink in. Every good officer I've ever served with had at least one spectacular failure early in their career. The difference between the good officers and the bad ones wasn't whether they failed. Everyone fails. The difference was what they did afterward. The investigation took 3 months. The final report was comprehensive. It documented every decision that led to the supply crisis, every warning that was ignored, every system that was unnecessarily dismantled. Lieutenant McLeod's name was featured prominently, along with his emails with Preston Ashford and his systematic dismissal of concerns raised by experienced NCOs. The consequences were significant. Preston Ashford and Allied Strategic Logistics Solutions faced federal charges for fraud, bid, rigging, and breach of government contract. Ashford personally faced 23 counts and eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a trial. He's currently serving 4 years in federal prison. Lieutenant McLeod was not court-martialed. The investigation found that while his judgment was catastrophically poor, his decisions did not rise to the level of criminal negligence. He received a general officer letter of reprimand, effectively a career-ending document for an officer, and was transferred to a non-deployable training unit. Colonel Harrison McLeod, Bradley's father, saw his own career affected. The investigation found that he had used his influence to place his son in the logistics position, despite concerns raised by other officers. He retired 6 months later, quietly and without ceremony. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, received a formal reprimand for failing to exercise adequate oversight of his logistics section. He was not selected for promotion to colonel and retired at 20 years. As for me, I was summoned to division headquarters for what I expected to be a routine meeting. Instead, I found myself face to face with Major General Kathleen Chen, no relation, the division commander. Staff Sergeant Feliciano, she said, gesturing for me to sit down. I've read your documentation. Every memo, every objection, every warning. You told them exactly what would happen, and you were ignored. Yes, ma'am. And then, when everything fell apart, you spent 18 hours on video calls walking the logistics team through emergency procedures. You personally reached out to contractors you had maintained relationships with for years. You saved the deployment. I just did what needed to be done, ma'am. The general smiled. That's exactly the kind of attitude that makes great NCOs. But it's also the kind of attitude that often goes unrewarded because people like you don't advertise their contributions. She slid a folder across the desk. I'm putting you in for the Meritorious Service Medal for your actions during the supply crisis. I'm also requesting a waiver to keep you on active duty past your 20-year mark if you're willing. The Army needs NCOs like you, and I'd hate to lose you to retirement when you still have so much to offer. I was stunned. After everything that had happened, being pushed out of my unit, transferred to the rear detachment, treated like a problem to be disposed of, I was being recognized. I don't know what to say, ma'am. Say you'll think about staying. We need your experience. Now more than ever. I did think about it. For a long time. In the end, I decided to stay. Not for the recognition or the medal, but because the Army really does need experienced NCOs who understand that systems and theories are no substitute for practical knowledge. The supply crisis became a case study at the Army Logistics University. The McLeod incident, as it came to be known, is now used to teach future logistics officers about the dangers of over-reliance on technology, the importance of maintaining redundant supply relationships, and the value of listening to experienced NCOs. I was even invited to speak to a class of logistics officers about what happened. Standing in front of a room full of lieutenants and captains, I could see a few who looked like Lieutenant McLeod had looked when he first arrived. Young, confident, certain that their education had prepared them for everything. I tried to reach them. I'm not here to tell you that your education doesn't matter, I said. It does. The theory you learned gives you a framework for understanding complex systems, but theory is a map, not the territory. The map shows you the roads, but it doesn't tell you about the pothole that opened up last week, or the bridge that washes out when it rains, or the shortcut that locals have been using for 50 years. I paused and looked around the room. Experience is what fills in the gaps. Experience is knowing that when the system says a shipment is on the way, you should still call the warehouse to confirm. Because sometimes the system is wrong. Experience is maintaining relationships with backup suppliers, even though it costs more, because someday your primary supplier is going to fail, and you'll need options. Experience is listening to the sergeant, who's been doing this job for 20 years, even when his methods don't match the textbook. A hand went up, a young lieutenant with an eager expression. Staff Sergeant, what's the most important thing you've learned in your career? I thought about it for a moment. Humility, I said finally. The understanding that you don't know everything, that the world is more complicated than any model can capture, and that the people who came before you weren't stupid. They just faced challenges you haven't faced yet. Stay humble, stay curious, and never assume that your way is the only way. Do that, and you'll be fine. It's been 2 years since the supply crisis. I'm still serving, now as the Senior Logistics NCO for a new unit at Fort Cavazos. I've rebuilt my systems from scratch, incorporating lessons learned from the Syria deployment. The new commander is a former enlisted soldier who became an officer through OCS. She understands the value of NCO experience, and she listens. Master Sergeant Williams retired last year with full honors. He writes me occasionally from his home in Texas, where he's teaching his grandchildren to fish, and enjoying his well-earned rest. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez was promoted, and is now running logistics for a brigade in Germany. She tells me that she still has that thumb drive I gave her, and she's used it to train a whole new generation of logistics NCOs. As for Lieutenant McLeod, I actually saw him once, about a year after the crisis. He was attending a training exercise at Fort Hood, working in some administrative capacity. He looked older, somehow. The cocky confidence was gone, replaced by something quieter. He saw me across the motor pool and hesitated for a moment. Then he walked over. Staff Sergeant Feliciano, he said, extending his hand. I never got a chance to thank you properly. For what you did during the deployment, for the advice you gave me on that phone call. I shook his hand. How are you doing, Lieutenant? He smiled ruefully. I'm doing okay. I won't be a logistics officer anymore. They're retraining me for military intelligence. A fresh start, I guess. And how's your father? The smile faded a bit. Retired. We don't talk much these days. He's disappointed in me. That's too bad. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. You know, I've thought a lot about what you said. About the difference between good officers and bad ones. About learning from failures. And I'm trying to be the kind who learns. He straightened his uniform. I know I can never undo what happened in Syria, but I can make sure I never make those mistakes again. And I can make sure the soldiers under my command benefit from the lessons I learned. I nodded slowly. That's the right attitude, Lieutenant. Keep working at it. He saluted, formally, respectfully, and walked away. I watched him go, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel: hope. Maybe, I thought, this whole disaster wasn't entirely wasted. Maybe one young officer learning humility the hard way would save future soldiers from the same mistakes. Maybe the 47 million in lost equipment, the damaged careers, the stress and the chaos. Maybe it would all mean something in the end. That's what I tell myself, anyway, because in 24 years of military service, I've learned one thing above all else: in the Army, as in life, everything is a lesson. The question is whether you're paying attention. And that, everyone, is the story of how a newly commissioned second lieutenant with a fancy degree and powerful connections tried to replace 24 years of experience with spreadsheets and automation, and nearly destroyed an entire battalion's logistics operation in the process. The total cost of the supply crisis. The investigation estimated 47 million in emergency contracts, lost equipment, contractor fraud, and operational delays. 3 careers ended. 1 contractor went to prison. And hundreds of soldiers experienced supply shortages that put them at risk. All because one person was too arrogant to listen to the experts around him. If you're ever in a position of authority, in the military, in business, in any field, remember this story. Remember that the people who have been doing the job for decades usually know things that aren't in any textbook. Remember that efficiency is meaningless if your systems can't survive contact with reality. And remember that experience isn't just repetition. It's wisdom earned through countless small failures and hard-won successes. Listen to your NCOs. Listen to your experts. Stay humble. Or don't. And then pray that someone like me is around to pick up the pieces when everything falls apart. Stay safe out there, everyone. And thanks for listening.